Right, so...
Sorry, do you want it recorded to the cloud or to your computer?
To the cloud.
To the cloud.
Yeah, very important.
Yes.
Recording in progress.
Right, so hello. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Mary Magdalene Studies Association Conference for 2023. I can't believe, but this is actually the 7th year we've done this, 7-year. I founded this in 2017 after I moved to France. I'm just going to do a little introduction about, what it is, why we're here, and then I'm going to hand over to our first speaker performer, who's called Jaiya, and I'll explain what she'll be doing in a minute. So after I moved to France in 2017 from Scotland, I was researching, as ever, sort of currents of esoteric Christianity, Gnosticism, Catholicism, Brexit, what's the meaning of life? And I came into contact with the living current of tradition that says Mary Magdalene came to Gaul after the crucifixion and resurrection, that she escaped. And there are variations of that story. But it's very deeply rooted in French religious history. And in the 12th century, even part of her remains were found in the south of France, and they're venerated to this day in a cave in Provence, which many people visit on pilgrimage. So I thought this is very interesting and has huge implications for what we understand about Christianity and the suppression of the feminine wisdom. I've always been a devotee of the goddess as an academic. I think academics should be open to feminine wisdom. And is it true that that was crushed in the early church by Peter and the male disciples? If it's true that Mary Magdalene was even possibly the consort of Christ and then was attempted to be written out of history, this has huge implications for why things went wrong in the last 2,000 years of history. So let's say it's a working hypothesis. I'm an academic sort of exploring the hypothesis that she might have been Christ's consort. She might have made it to Gaul. But I'm open to evidence. And the point of creating an academic association was, A, there isn't one. I looked carefully, I tried to find one. There isn't one. And yet Christians are supposed to be scholars. There's academic associations to study all kinds of other stuff, but not Mary Magdalene, like one of the most important apostles. I found that weird. So that's what we're doing here, to try and bring together scholars and practitioners and also artists, novelists, filmmakers, because Mary Magdalene has become a sort of, a venerable icon of a sort of resistance movement within Christianity against patriarchy and the oppression of feminine wisdom. And there are many versions of Mary Magdalene. So we've had 6 previous conferences, and every time there's a different, speakers with different versions, and we've got some interesting ones lined up today who will be exploring different aspects. You could say there's as many Mary Magdalenes as there are people on the planet, because everyone sees her in a different light. But that, I think, is why it's worth doing. So the other reason I've done this is because I'm really a peace scholar. I did my doctorate at the University of London in peace scholarship, and I specialise in interfaith conflict resolution. I think so many religious conflicts exist on the planet, disputes between different groups and ideologies. So I'm interested in the bigger interfaith implications of Mary Magdalene. Why isn't she mentioned in the Quran? Did the early Arabic scholars around Muhammad ever know of her? She was certainly mentioned in the writings of Mani, who was a Christian Gnostic in Iraq, who strongly influenced early Islam, as I've explained in my commentary on the Quran. And of course, Islam believes that everybody should get married and enjoy sexuality, and there's nothing sinful about that. They don't, and Muhammad was totally against this idea of celibacy as the way to godliness. He thought that was bonkers. So you would have thought they would have really been interested in Mary Magdalene and made something of her as a figure. So I'm scratching away in Islamic scholarship to see why, who's working on that. So, let's see. The idea is an open forum for people that have registered to speak, and then we've also started publishing a journal, which I have here, the Mary Magdalene Studies Association journal, which carries news about scholarship, discoveries, articles, and so on, including artwork. So it's very, very eclectic. We're interested in the history of art. A number of people have done PhDs on Mary Magdalene as portrayed in art. In medieval Europe, she was quite an important figure. She's often, she has an iconic presentation as someone with long hair that's been weeping a lot. But there are other forms of representation. So that's interesting. And also even in music. So I've discovered somebody's just written a PhD at the University of Cardiff on Mary Magdalene in music presentations, and wrote a piece of music herself as part of her PhD, which is, you can look this up, it's on her website at the University of Cardiff. So, and every year there are some new scholars working on different aspects of this. Will we ever find out the absolute truth? Well, what is truth in history? If she walked into the room and started telling us her story, maybe. So I'm open to that. Because my theory of transpersonal history is that history is not just documents and facts, it's memories which can be accessed perhaps through things like past life regression, deep hypnotherapy. Maybe we need to learn to tune into the past in a more subtle way. Because if you think about it, quantum theory explains everything is made of vibrations, quantum waves in a dance. Maybe if we tune our minds as historians to become more subtle to vibrations, maybe the traces of truth are left all there, and we can tune into them. So I'm into revising history, historiography as a profession, in the light of quantum theory and quantum metaphysics and new science, and saying we need to revise and upgrade our historical methodologies, and that these past events are in some way still resonant, we can tune into them. And I think we're all embedded with an inner Geiger counter that enables us to distinguish truth from falsehood. We have a sort of intuition. In the Christian language, that's called synderesis. It's our moral consciousness within us, in our souls, which tells us when something is true at a deep level. So that's what I'm really after here with this Mary Magdalene Studies Association, is to find the real truth of what was going on. And I should just add, we're not promoting any one particular version. I'm not saying, yes, Mary Magdalene came to France and is buried near Rennes-le-Château. No, she didn't come. She died in the war in Galilee, as Bruce Chilton said, who was one of our former speakers. Let's have all the different... Oh, and there's another chap who did a PhD in France saying she didn't exist. There is no Mary Magdalene. It was all a scribal error. And he proved in his PhD, which was passed, that actually there isn't a Mary Magdalene figure at all. So that's an extreme version, the non-existent Mary Magdalene. That seems a bit unlikely because there are so many Gnostic texts that have come down, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Pistis Sophia and others, in which she is speaking. And she does have this iconic role as a teacher of Gnostic wisdom. She's called the Apostle of the Apostles. Is that all just made up? Is that a projection? I somehow doubt that. I'd be very surprised. It seems that she was perhaps someone who'd had spiritual difficulties and Christ had helped heal her. Everybody goes through rough patches. And according to Bruce Chilton, she became the head of the, let's call it the aromatherapy division of the Sangha, as it was roaming around Galilee. She'd be the one, if you had troubles, you'd go to Mary Magdalene and she'd help you with healing oils and clear whatever was troubling your mind. That's quite nice. And also to say another way in which she's interesting nowadays is through film. Obviously we have films, and there have been a few new recent movies which feature Mary Magdalene quite strongly, and which are very interesting. And we're going to hear from one of our speakers later on about them, and who is herself a filmmaker in the goddess tradition. Right, I think, I just wanted to share here in France, this is the main kind of popular French history magazine. Secret d'Histoire comes out periodically, and you can get it in all French newsagents. And here's a whole issue on Mary Magdalene, dedicated to her art, so that the tradition lives on. And there are people researching it. Here's a picture of the famous Last Supper. Was she there? Is she in the picture? And there are various churches dedicated to her, including one in Vézelay, which we went to, which is not far from here, which has some of her relics. And also down in the south of France, in Provence, a crypt is there, which has some other relics. Somebody has done a PhD at the University of Oxford recently, also, on exploring the sarcophaguses of Provence in the Middle Ages here in France, because it was quite a thing to find a sarcophagus and then say it was very, very old. It brought kudos to the count in whose country it was found. And this woman has researched, because Mary Magdalene's sarcophagus was found in that time, the 1200s, and it's now the Basilica of Saint Maximin la Sainte Baume. This is a picture of this underground cave. And this woman at Oxford has researched this and other such sarcophaguses. And, again, it's a question of, was that really her body, or was it someone else? So there are mysteries. And among the relics are on that particular body there was some red hair. She's always shown as having red hair for some reason. And people have tried to analyse it, And in fact they found things that do seem to point to it being original. Some pottery was found with it that came from 1st century Syria, exactly the right place. Finally, why does it matter? There are scholars that look at the micro details, and analyse the hair and the DNA of people from that time period and so on. And that's interesting, and we gather those kind of pieces of evidence. But I'm interested in the bigger picture. I'm interested in the meaning of history. I'm a philosopher of history. And later on today, when there's time on the programme, I'll slot in a little talk about the importance of Mary Magdalene for the philosophy of history. And we meet at a critical time in world history and European history when people are still poised on mutual self-destruction. And my mother was an anti-nuclear weapons campaigner and would be turning in her grave. Her middle name was Mary, at the thought that Europeans might be about to blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons, which would then become the Third World War, and I don't think people in any continent would escape. So the question is whether there is some wisdom about peace that Jesus and Mary Magdalene stood for, that is still relevant to our time, that transcends chronological time and is more to do with psychological time. And then what is that wisdom? That's the reason why it's worth pursuing, I think. And what kind of gnosis is embedded in that wisdom, and how can we access it? So that's the sort of deeper context of what we're doing here. And as a Druid Christian myself, I'm very interested in these Gnostic undercurrents to Christianity. And here in the middle of Gaul, where we're based, which was Druid heartland of Europe, the Druids were very wise people, I think. They didn't have sophisticated technology, but they had an inner psychic technology. And I think that's why they resonated with the Christ story. And as St. Columba said, Christ is my Druid. there was a resonance between the Gauls who'd been oppressed by the Romans, conquered by Caesar, slaughtered in their hundreds of thousands, for just the glorification of one military guy gone crazy, for his ego. And from a Druid perspective, therefore, the Christian story makes perfect sense. It's like the karma of the Roman Empire converting to the faith of one of the people that are crucified. I mean, it's an astounding story. And I think we can make sense of it if we look at history as a series of undulating waves, but also there are particles, i.e. events, which happen. And they have archetypal resonance, as Jung would say. They mean something. History isn't just sort of flat, horizontal. We belong to many dimensions. And in the Druid community, we believe we live in the midst of an interdimensional matrix in which the gods and the underworld and this world are all, co-present to one another. And my reading, if you read the Gospels in depth, as I've done, and comment on them, you see that's where Christ was coming from too. The kingdom of heaven is among us. Don't look for the end of the world. It's already here. This is a Druid talking. So I think the Christians of Gaul, like Saint Martial, who was the local Christian here in Limoges and Toussaint-Coiffe, they realised that, as did St. Columba. And of course, finally, to finish, the Druids were peacemakers, mediators. And you couldn't be a Druid unless you'd sworn to not involve yourself in direct physical violence personally. You had to be above the battle. And I think that was Christ's position as well, because he never, that wasn't his way either. And Mary Magdalene and him must have had amazing conversations about peace and non-violence and what you do, in the face of injustice and oppression. And I think what they were trying to do is make a stand for peace and love. And eventually it was magnified, it was broadcast in miraculous ways, whether they foresaw it or, there are many mysteries there. Okay, so that's just to start the ball rolling, right? And a few thoughts to share. I hope that's of interest. And there's going to be many more revealed as we proceed. Right, now I'd like to introduce our first speaker.
I'm going to pause for a moment.
Recording stopped.
I'm going to, just because I've got a request for us to get closer to the microphone. Is this the microphone?
That's the microphone picking up, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I don't want to mess anything up. I got to move this.
We'd have to move that whole thing another 3 feet, which can be done. Yeah,
May
yeah.
I move? in
Sorry?
this? May
Yeah,
I
go
move?
for it. Now's
yeah,
your time.
it's still rolling. But I think...
Yeah.
And also, does this need to be in it?
Right, 1, 2, 3. There we are.
Great.
I just don't
The sound would be better.
And then,
Okay.
curious as well.
Right.
This is going to be a less squeaky chair.
Okay. This is speaking.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right. Okay, that's very good. Right. Okay. There we are. A few technical changes. Right.
Okay.
Recording in progress.
Right, so I'm going to just introduce our first speaker, who has come a long way to be here. She lives in Colorado normally, in Boulder, and is a world traveller. Jaiya is an author and a counsellor and a coach who's specialised in relationships and dysfunctional and how to understand your sexual nature, your erotic nature. And she's discovered a technique, a key to classifying the forms of sexuality that human beings have, which is fascinating. We met through the Wisdom Keepers Association, which we both belong to, which meets monthly. And she's quite, famous in that she just recorded a brilliant series on Netflix for the study of relationships and how we could improve them. And that's fascinating stuff, because obviously, you know, if Jesus and Mary Magdalene were in a relationship, that they might have been discussing some of these issues. And the question of Jesus' own sexuality therefore comes up, as well as Mary's, or, you know, anyway, these are things that are fascinating to discuss. So Jaiya's come all the way here via Barcelona and Ibiza, where she's been working, with a team of people, a fantastic musician who's going to be accompanying her during this musical performance of a musical piece about Mary Magdalene and her significance. And so, without further ado, let me hand over to you, Jaiya, and take it away.
Take it away.
Thank you.
All right, so Christian, you want to come up here with me?
Yeah.
Por favor.
You want to do that, sure?
Sure. This way a little more. Hello, everyone. Can we see you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tuck it in.
So I just wanted to begin by sharing a little history about the show. This was written by me as my student thesis almost 20 years ago. And Christian and I were in college together at the time. And I was really fascinated by Tantra, sacred sexuality, and started studying Mary Magdalene. And when it came time for me to write my senior thesis, I decided to write it about Mary Magdalene, and had a number of different influences. So I want to just talk to what influenced this show. The Magdalene manuscript, I don't know if any of you have read that book, but it has the idea, Ginger's read it, that this Egyptian aspect, kind of like Tantra, Isis and Osiris, and this mythology of resurrection with Osiris and Isis and their sacred relationship. So the idea of sacred relationship and resurrection and how that all coincided. And so I started the show just about Mary Magdalene and Christ's relationship. And this guy here, we happened to bump into each other and have a very divine feminine, divine masculine relationship that has its own very awesome story. And we had a experience, I will call it, a spiritual awakening per se, in each other's arms. That was felt like a very divine feminine, divine masculine, Christ Magdalene type of awakening. It was one of my very first awakenings, very young, of a full-on Kundalini, we became one. It was a very big event in our life. And if I haven't said this person's name, his name is Christian DeMehl. And Christian will be doing the piano for this piece today. And so part of the show is influenced by books that I was reading, like the Magdalene manuscript. Part of the show are actual words that he and I said to each other or sent to each other. So part of it was also based upon the dynamic that was happening and unfolding between the two of us. And so Magdalene manuscript, what other books? The Moon Beneath Her Feet was another one. There's even a little excerpt from that book in the show. So you're going to hear things like the Ka body, which is the Egyptian reference to creating an immortal body. But there's also things like the Methuna, which is a tantric ritual. And Christian and I were practicing a lot of Tantra at the time together. So there's a lot of reference to some of those things. So just wanted to give you a little background history on that. This is the first time we're putting it to music. So and it's interesting because it's also the full circle of our relationship, where we had this very intense experience in college and didn't know how to make sense of it at the time. And now we've reunited again in our lives. And so it's a really interesting moment right now to be doing this show again, which happened in school, and for us to reunite our lovership and for him to play the piano underneath and underscore the show. So you're experiencing something that no one's experienced before, in that we are not using canned music underneath, but live piano that Christian will be playing. Okay, anything?
Magdalene Laundries.
The laundries.
Oh, okay. So, yes, thank you both. When I first was writing the show, it was just about Mary Magdalene and Christ and the sacred relationship aspect. And then as I was researching, I came across something called the Magdalene Laundries. Are any of you familiar with the Magdalene Laundries? Yeah? Thomas? And so I watched a film about it that was based on a true story. And I was really struck by the fact that the last Magdalene Laundry closed in like 1996. And they were still putting women in these spaces where they were forced into forced labor, often laundries, and all the bodies of women that were found buried in these spaces. So as I was seeing that, I started forming this story in my brain of a woman in a Magdalene laundry speaking to Mary Magdalene, praying to Mary Magdalene. So the show is two women, there's an older woman in the show too that's in the Magdalene laundry. So these women who, one is really in the suffering and trying to understand what's happening with the Magdalene laundry, and the other is actually Mary Magdalene in her love affair with Christ. And so you have these two very juxtaposed stories, one that's very dark and colorless and one that has a lot of love and celebration in it. And so you'll see that as you go through the show. And what was interesting for me was I had written it, all of Mary's parts and then all of the woman in the laundry's parts, and then I cut it all up in my creative process and put it all in these interesting ways together to see how it would all fit and work together. And so that was a really fun process in terms of like, okay, this scene here goes perfectly with this scene with Mary, and putting it out of order. And so you'll see how that all came together as well in the show. And just a trigger warning, it does have pretty intense content in the show, themes of sexuality, themes of abuse and trauma, just because the pieces that are within the Magdalene laundry have those traumas within them. So letting you all know that is coming. And also I may slip into an Irish dialect every now and then, because I did, when I performed this show, and I also toured with it for just a minute and in different places that invited me to come to do a ritual version of it. I did it in an Irish dialect. I haven't done it in the Irish dialect since I first did all that. So, but if I slip into a little Irish dialect, it's just because I have a little somatic memory from doing it so many times in the dialect. But my plan today was just really to read it for you all with the music, so you get the experience of it. Good. Anything else?
I'm just sort of responding to some of what Thomas said, and the lead-in is just this idea of the waves of history, and just sort of acknowledging you've reflected that in our own dynamic and relationship, this wave of returning to a moment, and the wave of being back looking at Magdalene and Christ, and the wave of Magdalene in the past, Mary in the past, and these characters in the present, and the wave that's there. So there is just something very synchronistic about being here all together with you, being together with you and you, and putting the piece together. And part of what's fun in that vein, musically, just to share, is that some of the songs that you'll hear are fully improvised today. There's a sense of what they're going to be, but who knows? Some of them are emails or poems that Jaiya and I wrote to each other in college that 15 years later have been set to music now. You won't hear those words, but so there's this interesting cyclical aspect of the piece, of our relationship, of being here and how you let us in.
And I think of the story, of the Magdalene Christ story, there's a cyclical nature. Catherine McGowan, I think her name is, she has a series, it's fictional history. She actually says in it, it's not all fictional. She has a series, and in it they say over and over again, the time returns, the time returns, the time returns. And then the idea is that these sacred relationships return over and over, and we see these archetypal patterns over and over and over of of divine couples who teach the way of love. And this story really is a story of love. So to me, it's all about love. And the other phrase that I really love within those books, and also that Jesus says, is for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. So may you have ears to hear what's here for you today. Great.
Thank
You ready?
Thank you.
Yeah?
Right.
So I'm going to start with just reading a little setup before we go in of the characters so that you know, and a little bit of setting the stage for the show, because we don't have the visuals of me actually performing. So we'll set that up a little bit. So whenever you're ready, Christian, we'll underscore it. The Magdalene. Characters. Mary Magdalene, priestess of Isis, lover of Christ. She is a strong, wise woman, dressed as a goddess, a devotee of the goddess in the Isis cult mysteries. She wears a snake armband and tribal jewelry. She has tribal markings similar to the Ouled Nile, and her hands are adorned with henna. Young woman. She's the opposite of Mary. She's been victimized and appears weakened. She represents the victimization and shaming of women. At the top of the show, she's pregnant, and as the show goes on, she becomes more maddened and disheveled. She speaks with a Northern Irish dialect. She is a prisoner inside of a Magdalene asylum. Older woman. An older woman inside of the Magdalene asylum. She's hardened. Her voice rough from many years inside of the asylum. She also speaks with an Irish dialect and is played by the same actor as the young woman. Staging. The stage is split into two contrasting sides. To stage left, we have a large ankh, which is the top of the show, looks like a large cross, but is later revealed to be an ankh. There's a small altar with ritual tools, incense, candles burning. The side of the stage is filled with colors, rich fabrics, and textures. It feels temple-like. The other side of the stage is stark, black and gray colors. There's a simple mat on the floor. 3 black boxes are stacked behind. The words, "God is just," are illuminated on the boxes. There is no color, only a feeling of desolation and emptiness. Opening. House lights down. House music fades to silence. Curtains open. There's a single candle lit on stage right. The following prayer is said in the candlelight. Young woman. Mary, Mary of Magdala, apostle of the apostles, priestess of Isis, mystery of mysteries, I know you are not the sinner they have tarnished you to be. Let me transform. Let me learn the power of your love. From the past let me be free. In the present let me always be. And for the future may I see. You are the egg, your lover the phoenix. May I be reborn into the sacred love you shared. Scene 1. Silhouette lighting comes up in deep shades of crimson to reveal the shadow of a crucifixion. This reflects Christ on a cross. Music rises and we see a figure writhing in agony on the cross. Lights slowly come up and it is revealed that it is Mary as she steps off the cross. As the lights shift, we see that the cross is actually an ankh. The music rises and Mary begins to speak. Mary. Yeshua wasn't the only one crucified that day. I have been crucified by the patriarchal church for over 2,000 years, and it continues today.
Sinner, poor,